Hi guys, this is Dr. Christina Spalding, and this video is going to give you a quick preview of some of the information that we're going to be covering in my emotional animal course, which is going to be starting on July 18th. So what I'm going to be talking about today is an excerpt from the first week's lecture, talking about Dr. Paul Ekman and his theory of basic emotions. So this is taken, a lot of this is taken from an essay he wrote where he's speculating about how emotions might work. This is something that is still very much under debate within the scientific community. And so what I do in the first lecture is we talk about several different theories of emotion, including Ekman, Panskep, which many of you are probably aware of, and Barrett's theory of emotion. So it is pretty well agreed upon that emotions serve a function, that they have a purpose, and that purpose is basically to motivate behavior or to drive animals to attain personal goals. And frequently those personal goals are related to survival of one kind or another. And so emotions play a really important role in a number of different sort of domains of behavior, including social development and communication, health, and overall adjustment. One of the characteristics about emotions, and something that Ekman really emphasizes, is the fact that they are fast. They are very rapid appraisals of what is happening in the moment, and they allow the animal to react to certain important events. And when I say important, again, we're generally talking about something that is important from a survival perspective, or at least is perceived to be important from a survival perspective. And I just want to point out that when we're talking about social animals, which of course dogs are, and many of the other species that we work with, in case you happen to work with some species other than dogs, social relationships for social species are very important and frequently are related to survival, because if you are ostracized from the group, that can have a serious and dramatic effect on your likelihood to survive. And all of those things are sort of baked into the DNA of social animals. And so we definitely have a lot of emotions related to social relationships. So these rapid responses that occur include physiological changes that are preparing the animal for action. And this would include, for example, the stress response. It also includes behavior. So this is sending signals, again, when we're talking about social relationships, so sending signals to other individuals, as well as initiating an appropriate response to whatever that event is that is generating the emotion. And then subjective responses. And we will talk later in this class about the subjective experience in non-human animals, since they can't verbalize that. But for now, what I'm just going to say is that, and again, there's a fair amount of consensus about this, quite a bit of consensus, I would say, is that that subjective experience seems to be to serve as reinforcement or punishment for the behaviors. And so we're coming back again to learning theory and this concept of, certain behaviors are being reinforced or punished. When we talk about how fast our emotions, they do occur very, very rapidly. And in fact, it's so rapid that it often occurs without conscious awareness. And now Ekman focuses on people, right? And so we can get at this a little bit more in depth in people than we can in non-human animals, because we can actually ask them what they're experiencing while we're making other measures like behavior and physiological changes. And so that's how we can get at the fact that this happens without conscious awareness. But I suspect that this is something that also happens in other animals. And often these emotions bypass the need to think. And so if you are in a threatening situation where you need to act very rapidly, this is a huge advantage, because you don't want to be, if you're under threat, you don't want to be sitting there carefully weighing out all of your options, because in the meantime, you could actually be, captured or eaten or whatever, the threat is. But it's certainly not always good, right? So we can think of many situations where having a very rapid, strong emotional response that bypasses thinking is a negative thing, but it is, in many situations, is actually beneficial. So Ekman talks about this concept of universal or basic emotions, and these are emotional states that are shared among all humans. And again, we're going to talk more specifically about animals later on. This is a lot of what he talks about, I think, is very applicable to other animals. And again, we're going to get into that later, not in this preview lecture, but in the class. And the exact list and number of emotions is still under debate, but this is Ekman's current list. So he has fear. So again, animals, I don't think anyone debates whether or not animals experience the emotion of fear, anger, joy, sadness, disgust, and surprise. These are the 6 really well accepted basic emotions. And then he says there's sort of potentially this additional one, which is contempt. And, the question is, does this fall under something else like anger or disgust? And is it something that's universal, which means it's found in all cultures? So one of the other things that Ekman talks about is emotions and cognition. And so I mentioned this before, that emotion often bypasses thinking. And so and now we're starting to get into the area of sort of, this is still under investigation in science, so this is not completely confirmed, but this is what Ekman suspects is going on after researching emotion for literally decades, is that when you experience a strong emotion, you lose access to certain information. And so we do definitely have evidence that supports this. What he hypothesizes is that what happens is when you're experiencing a strong emotion, you go into what he calls a refractory state. And what happens when animals are in that state is that the information that they are processing is processed in a way that matches the current emotion. And what that means is if you have other information that's coming in that doesn't match your current strong emotion, that information is just sort of dismissed out of hand by the brain, without even necessarily being consciously processed by the animal. So I think a really easy example to come up with is PTSD in humans. And I'm going to use a human example because I think sometimes it makes it a little bit easier to relate to that. So if you're an individual with PTSD and your trauma is triggered, your overwhelming emotion is fear. And other information may be coming in that says you're not under threat, but because of that strong fear emotion, all of that information is being dismissed. So maybe your trauma is being triggered, just to be very stereotypical, maybe your trauma is being triggered by fireworks, for example, and you may have all kinds of information around you that show that you are not actually under threat and that those bangs are something that cannot harm you, and you're still having a panic attack. So that would be an example of this refractory state that he's talking about. And of course, if we're talking about animals, it's going to be a similar kind of thing. If you have an animal that is in a strong state of fear, they are going to be hyper focused on all of those perceived threats, and other information coming in may not even be sort of accessible to the animal in that moment. And I think this says a lot about, the importance of doing everything we can to keep animals out of that level of strong negative emotion, because you just can't work with them in that state. And one of the things that Ekman says, this is a direct quote from this essay, is we do not seek to challenge why we are feeling a particular emotion. Instead, we seek to confirm it. And I think this is a really powerful statement that helps illustrate why it can be so difficult to work with an animal when they're in that strong emotional state. And again, this is adaptive if the emotion is appropriate. So if you are actually in a threatening situation, you want to behave as if you're under threat, and you want to dismiss information that's coming in that may contradict that. The problem comes in when there is a mismatch between an animal's emotional response and what is actually happening. So Ekman talks about several different things we can do to reduce intensity. And well, not so much several different things, but how do you predict how hard it's going to be to reduce the intensity of that emotion? And so he says there's 6 different factors that are important. So the first one is the biological relevance. And this is the particular threat that's being perceived. How relevant is that sort of innately to the animal? So there's a common example. We won't get into this a ton in this particular lecture, but we think about the difference between spiders and guns. And this is something that has been studied and looked at, and people tend to show stronger fear conditioning to images of spiders as opposed to images of guns. And the reason that we believe that that is that we have evolved for, many hundreds of thousands, millions of years with having spiders, or snakes is maybe a better example, actually be a threat to us. Whereas guns are relatively new from an evolutionary standpoint. And so there's been quite a few studies that have shown that it's easier to condition people to be afraid of snakes than it is guns. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about biological relevance. Sometimes you have to spend some time thinking about this. Again, like I said, we may not think of social rejection as a threat to survival, but historically it actually probably was. And so social rejection and probably does, and isolation probably does have biological relevance. Then the question is the similarity to the original learning context. So wherever the animal learned this fear, if it's not an innate fear, putting them in situations that are more similar to that original learning are going to generate stronger emotions that are going to be harder to reduce. Whereas if it's more removed from the original learning and there's fewer similarities, it's going to be easier to reduce those emotions. Age when first learned. So fear learning that occurs at a young age is harder to reverse than fear learning that occurs at an older age. And then the initial emotional charge, which I think is really interesting. And so what he's talking about here is how strong was that initial emotional intensity. So the first time that the animal had this experience that resulted in fear or whatever the emotion was, how strong was that fear? So were they mildly afraid or were they panicking? So the stronger that initial emotional charge, the harder it's going to be to reduce the intensity of the emotion later on. The density of the experience, this is what he's talking about, is how often is this happening in a given time period. So I worked very hard with my dog to get him comfortable at the vet, and he did fine at the vet until he got very, very sick, and he had a very high density of negative experiences at the vet, where he was going in frequently, and every time he was going in, really unpleasant things were happening, and he was already not feeling well. And so this really turned him around completely, unfortunately. Although, he's at a fear-free vet now, and he's gotten much, much better. But we certainly went through a period of time where the vet became very, very scary. And it was because, in part, of that repeated short succession exposure to those fearful experiences. And then the last one is affective style. And we're going to talk more about this later on in the course, but this has to do with sort of individual variation in the strength of an animal's emotional response. So I'll say much more about that later, but for now, we're just going to leave it there. And here's another point is, we cannot choose our emotions. Animals cannot choose their emotions, but we can choose our behaviors. And so that's what we want to try and work on. But if you're reducing the intensity of the emotions, it's going to make it much easier to change behaviors. So one more thing, this is ending up to be a little longer than I intended, but I just want to touch on moods. And basically, moods are longer, less intense versions of emotions. So we might say we're in a bad mood. It's not going to be as strong as an emotion, and they tend to last longer. Emotions are very brief. They do not last long at all, maybe minutes, but not much longer than that. And the belief is that, or at least Ekman's belief is, and this is shared by many other researchers as well, that moods prime animals for certain emotions. And so we know that when an animal is in a particular mood, it is easier to trigger certain emotions. So if you're in a bad mood, for example, or a depressed mood, it's going to be more likely to trigger intense fear or sadness. So let me rephrase that slightly. So it's more likely that you're going to experience negative emotions, and they also tend to be more intense than they would be if you were not already in a bad mood. So you're experiencing them more frequently and more strongly than you would if you were not in a bad mood. And the same would apply to a good mood. Is it, or if you're, already feeling positive about the world or in a happy mood, then you're going to be more likely to experience, strong, happy emotions, and they're going to be more intense. And so in this way, moods decrease flexibility because they tend to sort of narrow that range of possibilities of the types of emotions and the intensity of emotions that are felt. And emotions do this as well. It's just that it's a much briefer window than what you're seeing with moods. And so Ekman questions whether or not this is an adaptation, if there's some benefit to this, or this is maybe just sort of a side effect that occurred where maybe if you're experiencing, for example, a lot of negative emotions in a row, that will kind of push you into a negative mood. And then it has these additional side effects. And that's an open question right now. But this is something that we do see happening with mood. And I think it's important to understand that distinction. So here are the details for the course. It begins on Monday, July 18th. It runs for 4 weeks. The lectures are on Mondays at 12 p.m. Eastern time. Sorry, that's not on the slide. For the lectures, you can attend live or you can watch the recording, which will be posted later that day. If you are interested in participating in the discussion sessions, which I would definitely recommend, we spend a lot of time in these discussion sessions talking about how we can best apply this material and making sure that all of these concepts are really well understood by the students. Those discussion sessions are on Thursdays at 12 p.m. and those are live only. They are not recorded. So if you sign up for as a full student, make sure that you can attend those discussion sessions live. For more details on how to register and the pricing and more information about what's in the curriculum, you can go to this link. And that link is also posted in the description of the YouTube video or on Facebook if you're watching this from Facebook. Thank you guys, and I hope to see you there.